She slammed the contract down. "Sign this non-compete or I'll blacklist you in 48 countries. Your career will be over." Her eyes were cold. "I have connections everywhere." I picked up the pen calmly. "You're right," I said. "Connections are everything." What she didn't know would destroy her. The paper hit my desk so hard it made my coffee mug jump. I looked up to see Brenda standing over me. Her manicured fingers still pressed against the contract like she was branding it into the wood. "Sign this non-compete or I'll blacklist you in 48 countries. Your career will be over." Her voice was ice. "I have connections everywhere." I stared at the document. 5 years of my life flashed before me. 5 years of building our international division from absolutely nothing. 5 years of 16-hour days, missed family dinners, sleeping in airport lounges, learning Mandarin and Portuguese and Arabic because I refused to rely on translators when closing deals. 5 years of creating something extraordinary while she sat in her corner office taking every ounce of credit. My hands were steady as I reached for the pen. "You're right," I said, meeting her gaze. "Connections are everything." "Hi, everyone. I'm Evelyn. I'm 34, and I'm about to tell you how I turned the worst moment of my career into the sweetest victory of my life. Before I go any further though, could you please take a few seconds to tell me in the comments where you're listening from? Because I want to know how far my story has reached. And if this resonates with you at all, please hit that like button and subscribe for more stories like this one. Trust me, you're going to want to hear how this ends. Let me take you back to the beginning because you need to understand what I built before you can understand what she tried to destroy. I started at this global consulting firm straight out of business school. Nothing fancy, just hungry and determined to prove myself. They assigned me to help expand their operations internationally, which back then meant maybe 3 countries and a lot of wishful thinking. I threw myself into it completely. While my colleagues were networking at happy hours, I was on calls with potential partners in Singapore at 2 in the morning. While they were enjoying weekend brunches, I was flying to Sao Paulo to meet with manufacturers who could help us establish supply chains that didn't exist yet. The work was brutal, but I loved it. Every new market we entered felt like conquering a mountain. Every partnership I forged felt permanent, built on trust and genuine understanding rather than just contracts and profit margins. Brenda became my supervisor 2 years in. She was hired from outside the company, brought in specifically to oversee international expansion. The irony wasn't lost on me that she was now managing the very operation I had created from scratch. At first, she seemed genuinely interested in what I'd accomplished. She asked detailed questions about our partnerships, our processes, our key contacts. I was naive enough to think she wanted to help me grow, but I started noticing things. In client meetings, she would present strategies I had developed as if they were her ideas. When we landed major contracts, her name appeared first on the internal announcements. When industry publications wanted to interview someone about our international success, somehow it was always Brenda who ended up quoted. The breaking point came during our expansion into African markets. I had spent 8 months building relationships with suppliers and regulatory contacts across 6 countries. The work was delicate, requiring cultural sensitivity and patience that you simply can't fake. When we finally secured a massive contract that would establish us as the dominant player in that region, Brenda scheduled a presentation to the board. She invited me to attend, which I thought meant I would finally get recognition for the work. Instead, I sat in the back of that conference room and watched her present my research, my strategies, my relationships as her own vision. She spoke about her approach to international expansion and her understanding of global markets. Not once did she mention my name. After the presentation, board members congratulated her on her innovative thinking. They praised her for building such a successful international operation. They talked about promoting her to vice president. I felt invisible, worse than invisible. I felt erased. That's when I started documenting everything. Every email I sent, every call I made, every relationship I built, I created a comprehensive record of exactly who had done what. Not because I was planning anything yet, but because I needed proof for myself that I wasn't going crazy. The industry began to take notice of our international success. Conference organizers invited us to speak at major events. Trade publications wanted to feature our expansion strategies. And every single time, it was Brenda who stepped into the spotlight. I watched her give presentations about markets she had never visited, using insights she had never developed, discussing relationships she had never built, and she was convincing. She had learned the language well enough to speak authoritatively about work she had never done. Meanwhile, I was becoming a ghost in my own operation. New team members were told that Brenda was the mastermind behind our international success. Clients who had worked with me directly were now being directed to communicate through Brenda's office. I was being systematically written out of the story of my own achievements. But I kept working. I kept building because I genuinely believed that excellence would eventually be recognized. I thought that if I just performed at an even higher level, if I delivered even more impressive results, the truth would become undeniable. I was so wrong. The opportunity came through a headhunter. A smaller consulting firm that specialized in emerging markets was looking for someone to lead their expansion into Asia. The role was perfect for me, combining everything I had learned with the chance to finally get the recognition I deserved. The interview process was incredible. For the first time in years, I was sitting across from people who wanted to hear about my actual experiences, my real insights, my genuine expertise. They had done their research and knew exactly what I had accomplished regardless of whose name was officially attached to it. When they offered me the position, I didn't accept immediately. I wanted to give Brenda a chance to counteroffer to finally acknowledge my value to the company. I thought maybe this external validation would force her to see what she was about to lose. I requested a meeting and explained the situation honestly. I told her about the offer and said I was hoping we could discuss my career path within the company. Her response was immediate and devastating. "Evelyn, I think you're overestimating your contribution to our international operations. Yes, you've been involved in the implementation, but the strategic vision and relationship management has always come from my level. If another company wants to hire you for basic operational work, that's certainly your choice." Basic operational work. 5 years of my life dismissed as basic operational work. I asked for time to consider my options. That's when I made the mistake of telling her exactly what the other company had offered me, including the title and the scope of responsibility. Her entire demeanor changed. The dismissive superiority was replaced by something much more dangerous. She realized that another company valued me far more than she had pretended to, and that terrified her. "Evelyn, before you make any hasty decisions, you should be aware that your employment contract includes some very specific restrictions regarding competition and client relationships. I'd hate for you to find yourself in legal trouble." I had read my contract when I signed it 5 years earlier, but I pulled it out that night and studied every word. The non-compete clause was broad but standard. It prevented me from working for direct competitors for 1 year and from soliciting our clients for 18 months. I thought I could work within those. The offer was from a different type of firm serving different markets. There shouldn't have been any conflict, but Brenda had different ideas. 3 days later, she called me into her office. That's when she slammed the contract down on my desk. "This is a revised non-compete agreement," she said. "Much more comprehensive than your original contract. It reflects the sensitive nature of the international relationships you've been exposed to." I read through it quickly. The restrictions were insane. Not just 1 year, but 3 years. Not just direct competitors, but any company that operated in the same markets. Not just soliciting clients, but having any professional contact with anyone in our network. "This isn't legally enforceable," I said. "Maybe not in court," she replied. "But I don't need a court to destroy your career. I have relationships with every major firm in this phone call from me, and you'll find that doors stop opening. References become unavailable. Opportunities disappear." She leaned forward, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "Sign this non-compete or I'll blacklist you in 48 countries. Your career will be over. I have connections everywhere." That's when I picked up the pen and said those words that would change everything. "You're right. Connections are everything." Because as I signed that ridiculous contract, I realized something that Brenda had completely missed. Yes, she had connections, but I had relationships. For 5 years, while she was taking credit for my work, I had been building genuine trust with partners, suppliers, and clients around the world. They knew my voice on late-night calls when crisis struck. They knew my problem-solving style when deals seemed impossible. They knew who actually understood their markets, their challenges, their goals. Brenda had her name on the organizational chart and her business cards in expensive holders, but I had something much more valuable. Respect earned through competence and consistency. I signed her contract without argument. Then I submitted my resignation effective immediately. "Where are you going?" she asked. "I'm taking some time to think about my next steps," I said. "Exactly 90 days, actually. I believe that's the mandatory cooling-off period specified in this contract." Her smile was satisfied, almost predatory. She thought she had won. For the next 3 months, I disappeared completely from the industry. I didn't attend conferences, didn't take meetings, didn't respond to professional inquiries. To anyone watching, it looked like Brenda had successfully ended my career, but I wasn't idle. I was planning. I spent those 90 days studying the contract I had signed with obsessive detail. Every word, every clause, every possible interpretation. I consulted with 3 different employment lawyers, not because I wanted to break the agreement, but because I wanted to understand exactly what I could and couldn't do within its terms. What I discovered was fascinating. The contract was designed to prevent me from competing with my former employer or working with their clients, but it said nothing about creating entirely new categories of service that didn't exist when the contract was written. I also spent those 90 days reaching out to relationships I had built outside our immediate client base. Vendors, suppliers, industry associations, regulatory bodies, academic institutions, people who knew my work but weren't covered by any contractual restrictions. And I researched. I studied emerging trends in international business, new technologies that were reshaping global commerce, regulatory changes that were creating opportunities and challenges that most consulting firms hadn't even identified yet. By day 89, I had a complete business plan for something that had never existed before. Not a consulting firm that would compete with my former employer, but an advisory service that would address problems the traditional consulting industry wasn't equipped to handle. On day 91, I filed the paperwork to establish my own company. I called it Global Insight Advisory, and our specialty was helping companies navigate the increasingly complex intersection of technology, regulation, and cultural adaptation in international markets. We weren't management consultants. We weren't implementation specialists. We were strategic advisors for challenges that fell between the cracks of traditional services. The timing was perfect. While I had been building traditional international operations for my former employer, the world had been changing rapidly. New trade agreements, emerging technologies, shifting regulatory landscapes, evolving cultural expectations. The old playbook was becoming obsolete, but most consulting firms were too invested in their existing approaches to adapt. I, on the other hand, had spent 90 days doing nothing but studying these changes and designing solutions. My first client came through a contact I had made 2 years earlier at an international trade conference. He was the head of strategic planning for a technology company that was struggling to expand into Southeast Asian markets. They had hired 2 different consulting firms and weren't getting the results they needed. The problem wasn't their strategy or their implementation. The problem was that they were approaching 21st century markets with 20th century thinking. They needed someone who understood both the traditional business fundamentals and the emerging realities that were reshaping international commerce. Our 3-month engagement was so successful that they immediately hired us for expansion into African markets. Then they referred us to 2 other companies facing similar challenges. Word spread quickly through networks I had been building for years. Not the official business networks where Brenda held influence, but the informal relationships between people who actually did the work. Project managers, regional directors, implementation specialists, technical experts, the people who knew who really solved problems and who just took credit for solutions. Within 6 months, Global Insight Advisory had 12 clients across 4 continents. We were profitable from month 3. We were turning down projects because we couldn't keep up with demand. But the real victory came when the industry started to take notice. Trade publications began writing about our innovative approach to international expansion. Conference organizers invited me to speak about emerging trends in global business. Industry associations asked me to contribute to their research on best practices for cross-cultural operations. For the first time in my career, my name was attached to my ideas. My insights were attributed to me. My expertise was recognized as mine. Meanwhile, at my former company, things were falling apart. Without my institutional knowledge, Brenda was struggling to maintain the relationships I had built. Partners were complaining about communication breakdowns. Projects were running over budget and behind schedule. New market entries were failing because the cultural insights I had developed weren't documented anywhere she could access them. She tried to hire replacements, but none of them had the years of relationship building and market knowledge that I had accumulated. They were starting from zero in markets where success required deep established trust. The annual International Business Conference was scheduled for October, 7 months after I had started my own company. This was the industry's most prestigious event where the biggest deals were announced and the most important relationships were reinforced. My former company had a prominent speaking slot. Brenda was scheduled to present their international strategy to an audience of over 2,000 industry leaders. I wasn't planning to attend. I had been invited to speak at 3 different panels, but I had declined. I wanted to avoid any appearance of competing directly with my former employer. But 3 weeks before the conference, I received a call that changed everything. James Morrison, who served on the board of directors at my former company, requested a meeting. He had heard about Global Insight Advisory through multiple channels and wanted to discuss a potential collaboration. We met at a neutral location, a quiet restaurant downtown. James was direct and thoughtful, asking detailed questions about our approach, our results, our vision for the future of international business. Halfway through our conversation, he said something that stopped me cold. "Evelyn, I have to ask you something directly. Were you the primary architect of our international expansion over the past 5 years?" I chose my words carefully. I was significantly involved in the development and implementation of many initiatives. "That's not what I asked," he said. James Patterson from Morrison Industries told me that when they needed help with their Asian expansion, you personally flew to Tokyo 3 times in 1 month to solve problems that our senior leadership couldn't address. Rachel Chen from Pacific Dynamics said you spent 2 years building the relationships that made their joint venture possible. David Kumar from Global Supply Solutions said you were the only person at our company who understood their regulatory challenges well enough to help them navigate government approvals. He paused, studying my face. These people don't know Brenda exists. They've never heard her name, but they all know you. I didn't respond immediately. The non-compete contract I had signed prohibited me from disparaging my former employer or discussing internal operations. James, I'm not able to comment on internal company dynamics, but I can tell you that I'm proud of the work I did and the relationships I built. He nodded slowly. I thought so, which makes me very curious about something else. Brenda is presenting our international strategy at the conference next month. But based on what I'm hearing from our partners, our international operations are struggling significantly. Projects are failing, relationships are deteriorating, and we're losing ground to competitors in every major market. That's when I understood why he had really wanted this meeting. The board was starting to realize that something was very wrong with their international division. They were seeing the results without understanding the cause. They knew that the person who had built their success was gone, but they didn't know why or how. James, I can't discuss my former employer's operations, but I can tell you that international business is becoming increasingly complex. Success requires deep relationships, cultural understanding, and the ability to adapt quickly to changing conditions. Companies that rely on outdated approaches or that don't invest in building genuine partnerships are going to struggle. He understood exactly what I wasn't saying. Would Global Insight Advisory be interested in consulting for companies that are struggling with international operations? That depends on the specific situation, I said. We work with companies that are serious about innovation and adaptation. We don't work with companies that are just looking for quick fixes or that aren't willing to acknowledge fundamental problems with their approach. We shook hands and he said he would be in touch. 2 weeks later, he called with an update that made everything clear. Brenda's presentation at the conference had been a disaster. She had prepared remarks about our successful international expansion, highlighting major achievements and outlining ambitious plans for future growth. But she had made a critical error. She had based her presentation on outdated information and had fundamentally misunderstood several key relationships. When she claimed credit for establishing our partnership with a major Asian conglomerate, the CEO of that company was sitting in the front row. He interrupted her presentation to ask why the joint venture she was describing bore no resemblance to the actual agreement they had signed. He also wondered why their primary contact at our company, who had spent 2 years building the relationship, was no longer with the firm. When she discussed our expansion into African markets, 3 different partners stood up to ask why their contracts hadn't been honored, and why communication had broken down so completely that they were considering legal action. When she outlined plans for entering new markets, industry experts in the audience pointed out that her strategies ignored recent regulatory changes that made her approach completely unfeasible. By the end of her 30-minute presentation, the audience was restless and confused. The question and answer session became an interrogation. Partners were publicly questioning our company's competence. Competitors were taking notes on our weaknesses. Board members were looking increasingly uncomfortable. The aftermath was swift and brutal. Within 48 hours of the conference, 3 major partners had formally requested meetings to discuss their concerns about our international operations. 2 clients had initiated reviews of their contracts with us. Industry publications were running articles questioning whether our company could maintain its international leadership position. James called me the following Monday. The board met yesterday in emergency session, he told me. We're facing a crisis that we don't fully understand. Our international division is falling apart, but we don't know how to fix it because we don't understand what we did right in the first place. He paused, and I could hear the frustration in his voice. Evelyn, we need help. Not just consulting help, but someone who understands our business, our relationships, our challenges. Someone who can help us rebuild what we've lost. What about Brenda? I asked. Brenda has been reassigned to our domestic operations. She'll be managing our regional office in Denver. I felt a moment of satisfaction so pure it was almost overwhelming. But I kept my voice professional. James, I appreciate your confidence in Global Insight Advisory, but I need to be clear about something. We don't do traditional management consulting. We help companies adapt to new realities in international business. If you're looking for someone to restore your old approach, we're not the right fit. That's exactly what we need, he said. We need someone who can help us build something new, something that works in today's environment. We need innovation, not restoration. We negotiated for 2 weeks, not just about scope and fees, but about structure and autonomy. I made it clear that Global Insight Advisory would operate as an independent partner, not as a traditional consultant taking direction from internal management. The final agreement was better than anything I could have imagined when I signed that non-compete contract 8 months earlier. Global Insight Advisory would become the exclusive strategic advisor for all international operations at my former company. We would have direct access to the board, independent budget authority, and complete autonomy over our methodology and approach. We would help them rebuild their international division from the ground up, but we would do it our way. And Brenda? She would have no authority over international operations whatsoever. The official announcement went out on a Tuesday morning. Industry publications covered it as a major strategic partnership. Partners and clients who had been concerned about our company's international competence suddenly had confidence restored. But for me, the sweetest moment came 3 days later when I received an email that had been forwarded through multiple channels. It was from Brenda, sent to the executive team with a subject line that read, "Concerns about external partnership." The message was exactly what I expected. She questioned whether it was wise to work with a consultant who had such intimate knowledge of our operations. She wondered whether there might be conflicts of interest. She suggested that the company should consider developing internal expertise instead of relying on outside advisors. The response came from James, copied to the entire executive team. "Brenda, thank you for your input. However, decisions regarding international operations are no longer within your purview." Global Insight Advisory was selected based on their proven expertise and their understanding of the relationships that are critical to our success. We are confident that this partnership will restore our leadership position in international markets. I printed that email and kept it in my desk drawer, not as a trophy, but as a reminder of something important. The best revenge isn't destruction, it's creation. While Brenda had spent her energy trying to bury me, I had built something she could never control. While she had plotted to end my career, I had created a business that made me more successful than any traditional employment could have offered. The partnership with my former company lasted 2 years and was incredibly successful. We rebuilt their international division, established new market leadership, and created approaches that became industry standards. But more importantly, those 2 years established Global Insight Advisory as the premier strategic advisor for international expansion. We grew from a one-person operation to a team of 12 with offices in 3 countries and clients across 6 continents. Today, 5 years after I signed that non-compete contract, Global Insight Advisory is recognized as one of the most innovative firms in international business strategy. We've been featured on the cover of 3 major trade publications. I've given keynote speeches at conferences around the world. I've advised governments, multinational corporations, and emerging companies on how to succeed in global markets. And Brenda, she's still managing that regional office in Denver. But here's what I want you to understand. This isn't really a story about revenge. It's a story about recognizing your own value even when others refuse to see it. For years, I allowed someone else to define my worth, to take credit for my achievements, to control my narrative. I thought that if I just worked harder, if I just delivered better results, the truth would become obvious. But the truth is that some people will never give you the recognition you deserve no matter how much you achieve. They will always find ways to diminish your contributions and elevate their own importance. The real victory isn't in destroying them. It's in building something so undeniably yours that their opinions become irrelevant. When I signed that contract, when I accepted those restrictions, when I disappeared for 90 days, I wasn't planning revenge. I was planning resurrection. I was betting on myself in a way I had never done before. I was choosing to believe that my relationships, my expertise, my integrity would be worth more than any job title or company affiliation. And I was right. So if you're watching this because someone has tried to bury you, if someone has taken credit for your work, if someone has threatened to destroy your career, I want you to remember something. They can take your title, they can take your office, they can even take your clients, but they can't take your relationships, your knowledge, your integrity, or your determination. The most powerful revenge is becoming so successful that their approval becomes meaningless. Build something they can't control. Create value they can't diminish. Develop relationships they can't manipulate. And then watch as their threats become whispers, their power becomes irrelevant, and their names become footnotes in the story of your success. If this story resonated with you, if it gave you hope or inspiration, or just reminded you that justice sometimes does prevail, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to my channel. Your support means everything to me, and it helps ensure that stories like this reach the people who need to hear them most.